The Global Peace Index for 2023 has been released today, and the results are perhaps not surprising. For the 9th consecutive year, global peacefulness has declined. Let's get more details now from Serge Stroobants, Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa at the Institute for Economics and Peace, which conducts this yearly report. Mr. Stroobants, thank you so much for your time. First of all, how do you measure peace?
Well, this is a very complex index. We measure peace through 23 indicators, which are distributed over 3 domains. So we look at conflict, internal and external conflict fought. We look at the internal safety and security within societies. And finally, we look at levels of militarization per country.
So I want to focus on South Africa first before we look more globally. We've slipped a number of places since last year. Now, in 2022, we were 118th out of 163 countries, which apparently was our best rating in about 14 years. But this is an improvement despite the July 2021 riots, which did fall into that accounting period. I'm curious as to why our rating went up for 2022 and has gone down for 2023.
Well, we have seen a continuous problem with infrastructure, but also a balance between governance and the effects of governance also. So we have seen violent demonstration rising up, but also violent crime, and especially the perception of violent crime rising. So because of the complexity of the index, you will need to have several indicators where you will see an increase of the impact on the South African society. But there again, it's a trend that we see throughout the region also, and not only in your country.
So what is happening in the region? I mean, not all countries, not all our neighbours have such a high crime rate as South Africa.
Mm-hmm. Well, what we clearly see, and that's valid for the entire subcontinent, so sub-Saharan Africa, we see the number of internal and external conflicts being fought on the rise, and we also see a rise in violent demonstrations and political instability. So we see a large impact on violence throughout the continent, and also lower levels of resilience to cope with the impact of this violence. We also see that several countries are really hit by conflict. We can think about Ethiopia, for example, and the conflict in Tigray, which generated more casualties than the conflict in Ukraine last year. And we can, of course, think about Mali, Burkina Faso, and the countries of the Sahel, which are really facing internal problems and problems of the impact of terrorism that can be considered today as the epicenter of international terrorism.
It's really interesting that the data shows a higher number of conflict deaths in Ethiopia than Ukraine, and yet Ukraine and the conflict there is probably the one conflict that has touched almost every country in the world. It's had a massive impact on our economy. There's lots of concern that this could create a polarized situation and lead to a third world war. Talk to me about Ukraine and how you assess what's going on in Ukraine and in Russia.
Well, clearly at the moment, I think we can go back to the events of the weekend and the Wagner action in the weekend. I think what we will see there, we can have a triple analysis of this. Of course, we will see that the most competent Russian troops on the front have now disappeared, with Wagner not being present there anymore. Maybe we will see the opening of a new front coming from Belarus. So clearly in the conflict, we might see a direct impact. Internally in Russia, we clearly see the weaknesses of the system. I think that those have been displayed over the weekend. But I think, and this is where the Institute is more concerned, is looking at the international scene, especially at sub-Saharan Africa. We have seen that Wagner has been present in more than 8 countries in Africa, some of them being destabilized by their presence. So that's a gap which is going to be created in those countries. So we foresee to see really a high impact of on the international scene, on international Russian politics and their presence in the African continent.
It's interesting that I think it's for the last 9 years, global peacefulness has declined. What you do is you look at risk, you look at all these indexes. Are you able to see a pattern of a build-up that could take us to the edge of a global war scenario?
So what we have seen over the past decade is, and even more than the past 10 years, up to 15 years also, we have seen that conflict has really been the motor of this decrease in the levels of peacefulness globally. Joined to that, you will see also levels of militarization on the rise, especially when it comes to direct investment. So the number of US dollars or euros being spent on the military. What we see there is a disparity between some countries really investing massively. That would be China, the US, and India, where other countries really facing the impact of violence do not have the luxury to continue to invest in militarization or at least violence containment. So if you want to look out to a potential major conflict, well, you need to look out at those countries really investing massively into their military at the moment.
Talk to me about countries that are the most peaceful. Which is the most peaceful country in the world?
Iceland has always been the most peaceful country in the world in the 17 editions of the Global Peace Index, followed by New Zealand. So clearly there you see a first pattern. So those are island states really separated from a big potential geopolitical implication. So clearly there what we see on top of the index is countries like this, but also most of the liberal democracies, especially Western liberal democracies. We see clearly that democracy with all its flaws is still the system leading to less violence or the least violence possible.
And I noticed that Ukraine recorded the largest deterioration. Obviously, it fell, I think, 14 places to 157th. Now, bearing in mind, you assess 163 countries. Which country is the least peaceful in the world?
Well, we see for Ukraine, it's obvious that it's the impact of its neighbor which created this large decrease in peacefulness and the war in its territory. When we look at the other countries over there, we will most of the time see countries from sub-Saharan Africa, the MENA region, and what we call South Asia, so countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan, which are impacted by a series or a large number of different strategic factors influencing peace and security. We will find them back also on indexes measuring impact, which would be the Global Terrorism Index or the Ecological Threat Report, looking at the impact of ecological degradation combined with the levels of resilience. So those are the parts of the world where different forms of impact are very high and levels of resilience are very low.
If I speak to you in a year from now, do you expect this trend to continue declining? I mean, are we moving towards a less and less peaceful time? Does it work that way?
Well, we can clearly see this decline, which has started about 10, 15 years ago. And we don't really see positive signs which could lead to less conflict in the coming years and maybe less casualties also in the coming years. We don't really see a huge investment in high levels of resilience or in violence containment or the end of potential conflicts. We have seen a rise in the number of conflicts. Really, more than 90 countries are now involved in some form of external conflict also. So I've seen an internationalization of conflicts. We see that those conflicts last for a long time. But what we clearly see also is that those conflicts cannot be won. And modern conflicts cannot be won and have a huge economic impact. We have an estimation of the total cost of violence last year at about 17.5 trillion US dollars, which is about 13% of the world GDP. So even if we don't go into the direction of more peace, we should think about the economic impact of violence and the economic impact of conflict and how we could create a better world if we would decrease this investment in violence.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. Important information there from Serge Stroobants, Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa. He's from the Institute for Economics and Peace that puts together this survey on global peace.